Alright, now we are looking at figured bass. Figured bass is a shorthand that has been used for a long time to describe, it's basically a blueprint for a chord progression. The previous example, where all four voices were actually sketched out and fully realized, where basically our job at that point was to analyze what was there. So all the notes were already written and we just had to figure out the chord progression based on the pitches that were written. Figured bass is actually the same amount of information, but some is added and some is omitted. So, instead of having all four notes and trying to figure out what the third, what the root is, what position they're in, and what the Roman numeral is, we have been given the baseline of a progression, and then we're also told whether or not that chord is inverted and how it's inverted if it is. So that actually tells us everything we need to know. By deductive reasoning and some practice, we can figure out exactly what this chord progression actually is just based on the lowest note in each chord, which is what this is, hence the term figured bass. We have the baseline. This is non-negotiable. These are the lowest notes in each chord. That's what's given to us. But based on what we know about chord progressions and inversions and Roman numerals, we can deduce what chord is actually happening on each beat. And we could write out the voices in a lot of different variety of ways on top of this baseline, but what would not change is the chord progression. It wouldn't change what notes are in the chord. It wouldn't change the inversion of the chord or the quality of the chord. The only thing we could sort of have a decision about would be how to space the chords, and what register, maybe what instruments to use the chords. I use cello just because it's in bass clef, but this would typically be for keyboard instruments because you would just be given a bass line, so you have the blueprint for the progression, and then your responsibility as the keyboard player, whether it be organ or harpsichord, piano, would be to flesh out the chords and actually play the other notes as well. And how you played them was a little bit up to you, but again, the root of the chord, the quality of the chord, and the inversion of the chord is dictated by the figured bass. So, just like doing analysis for a fleshed out chord progression, the very first and most important step is to establish the key. Never take that for granted. Especially when we get into minor keys, because you don't want to just assume that you know what key it's in. I'm going to trust that you know your key signatures, and if you didn't, you would have looked it up, so I'm just going to tell you we're in the key of A. So, if I'm in the key of A, this first chord here, I know that the lowest note of the chord is A. I also know, because there's nothing underneath it, there's no little 6 or a little 6/4 or any other things that we're going to learn eventually that could possibly go underneath this. It's completely blank. Therefore, I know that this note right here is the root of the chord. So if the root of the chord is A, how is that related to A? Well, it's a 1 chord. Hopefully that wasn't too hard to figure out. So if I count from A to A, I haven't really gone anywhere, so we're just going to call that 1. It's the first note in the scale, 1. I'm not going to put any 6 or any 6/4 next to this because it's telling me this is not inverted. This is a root position chord, otherwise there would have been something underneath here. Alright, second chord here. This is a C sharp. I know it is the lowest note in the chord. This little 6 here is telling me that this chord is in first inversion. And if you remember, first inversion means the third is lowest bass note. Oops. So in first inversion, the third is the lowest note. So if this is the third of the chord, what must the root be? So let's the C sharp. In what kind of chord is the C or the C sharp the third of the chord? Well, it looks like that's the third, so this must be an A chord. So if it's an A chord, just like the first one, then that's still going to be a 1 chord. because I still had all the information I needed. Now, I like people to be thorough, so even though it seems redundant because it's right here, I like people just to acknowledge that they know it's in first inversion. I want you to write this little 6 here. And again, sorry, it's not that little. It just takes a lot of time to make it go superscript and everything like that. So we've got a 1 chord, root position A, and then in this one, again, it's in first inversion because of this little 6. The C sharp is the lowest note, so that means that if this is the third of the chord, then the root would be right here, which would be A. So it's actually the same exact chord, we've just inverted it. We put the third in the bass. Let's look at another one. So I've got a D here with nothing underneath. What does that mean? It means that the D is the root of the chord. So I'm pretty much done, but there's nothing underneath. There's not a lot to figure out. You're just counting from the key note to the root note. So I'll go ahead and say A, B, C, D. 1, 2, 3, 4. And just to reiterate, we know it's a major chord because nothing's been changed. It's all diatonic, which means it's in the key. Everything fits within the key. And these chord qualities don't change. The 4 chord is going to be a major chord. Alright, now we did it again. We have the same note here now. So it's another D. And a lot of people would make this mistake. Maybe going too fast. And they would just say, okay, I know it's in first inversion because I see the little 6. There's the D. A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's a 4, 6. However, that is very wrong. That's a very common mistake, but it's wrong because we used the wrong information to determine the Roman numeral. So let's delete that. It is a first inversion chord. So that little 6 means it's in first inversion, which means that this is the third of this mystery chord. So if D is the third of the chord, reference my little chart, there's thirds, there's D, the root must be B. So the root of this chord is B. The little 6 is telling me it's in first inversion, which means the third is in the bass. This is a D, so when I go to the chart, D is the third of what chord? Oh, a B chord. So now, how is B, let's just say this is a B chord. How is B related to A? Let's count. A, B. 1, 2. So I'm going to put a little 2 in there. And I put a little 2 in there just to remind you because 2 chords in major keys are minor. Ba-boom. So that would be a 2, 6. Ruh-roh, we have a different thing here. Okay, so this is an E. Now I see this 6, 4 underneath. I'm not going to treat this note as the root of the chord. So you may be thinking, oh, A, B, C, D, E, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Call this a 5, 6, 4 chord and rush through it. Whenever you see the little numbers down here, that's telling you it is not the root of the chord, that this is actually a different part of the chord. So 6, 4 tells us it's in second inversion. And in second inversion, that means the 5th is lowest, or bass note. I'll get rid of the playback controls there. Get rid of that B chord. So, if this is the 5th of the chord, because this is telling me it's in second inversion, if this is the 5th of the chord, and it's an E, let's check it out. So in what kind of chord is E the 5th? Looks like it's an A chord. So if E is the 5th, then the root must be A. So what's A in the key of A? I won't insult your intelligence by making you think about that for too long. So that would be a 1 chord. We'd call it a 1, 6, 4 chord. Sorry, the inversion numbers are so humongous. So that's a 1, 6, 4. Now again, we have a repeated note, but now there's nothing underneath. So that means that this is the root of the chord as well. So if this is the root, it must be an E chord. So we don't really need to solve any mysteries there. It's just an E chord, so we're going to count from A to E, which is again the key to the root. So A, B, C, D, E, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 chord. Boom. This last chord is an A and nothing underneath it. It started with an A and nothing underneath it. Unless we switched keys somewhere, which didn't happen, then the answer is not going to change. It's a 1 chord all over again. So once you get used to figured bass, you may find it's actually much easier to decipher than looking at fully fleshed out pitches, because there is just less to look at. There's less notes to identify and then potentially unscramble. The tricky part to figured bass is just knowing, again, bass note and root note are not the same. When you see one of these little qualifying numbers underneath, like a 6 or a 6/4, you have to remember that this bass note is not the root. So you cannot treat it like the root. You do not use this pitch to determine the Roman numeral. You have to figure that this is a different part of the chord and then use that to figure out the root of the chord. The root is what determines the Roman numeral. So again, you can use the Google form. Well, please enter your answers on the Google form, but you can use the Google Doc as a reference so that you don't have to look back and forth if that makes things easier. And you can print it out and write on it, obviously, but do make sure that you enter your answers in on the Google form. Hopefully this has been helpful, and feel free to come back and watch this video anytime. Pause it, go back. Hopefully it's helpful, and obviously email and ask questions when you're in person. And I hope this was helpful. All right, that is a crash course on figured bass.